Devil in a red dress. Call 911, I'm a killer. You know I hate to confess. Bang, bang, got my hand on the trigger. The devil in a red
Hello, Trabant.
dress. Call
Hello,
911,
Tito.
I'm a killer.
What are we going to talk about today?
In our new podcast today, we are going to answer two very important questions. Number one, how old is China? And number two, is China a continuous civilization?
Wow. Well, first of all, what is a civilization?
Well, in short, I would say that civilization is a country or the culture of the country or one whole country who is more developed than any countries around it.
Very good point. Yeah. They all follow some. They all have some common characteristics, and one of these characteristics, which is very important, is, for example, writing. Because not if a state has a written system of keeping records, not only does that show that they are maybe at a higher level of development than the other polities around them, but they also have some records for us to read now.
Okay, some outstanding characteristics, I would say.
Yes, good point. So
Okay.
we can see some ancient civilizations here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay, so
You
see, on every continent, basically.
Yeah, at different times on different continents, all of them a little bit different, but they would, most of them would have some kind of a written system. Maybe not immediately, but at some point they do have. This is how we can identify them. So it's not just an archaeological record, but you know, um, these kinds of written records as well.
So we can see that China, according to this map, was at some point civilization and its culture was outstanding in the region when China was located.
Right, and you can see it mentions 2200 BCE, but around this is the time of the semi-mythological Xia dynasty. Now you do have different archaeological sites. You do have different archaeological records from China around this time. The only problem is we don't have written records around this time that would indicate who is who, or let's say point to the Xia dynasty specifically, right?
Okay, so how can, if we don't have any written record, how can we assign this civilization to the current or later Chinese civilization?
That is a very good question. Yes. Well, let's listen to what an expert on the topic says.
Okay.
Who can we see here?
Okay, I see Xi Jinping and Trump in Forbidden City.
Yeah, and they're having a nice leisurely walk. Let's see what they're saying to each other.
Okay.
Yeah, so Trump starts with this idea. I don't know where this came from, of 5,000 years. Yeah, he's trying to find
Trying
some
to
common topics. Yeah.
interesting interesting topic.
Yeah.
Interesting yeah, okay.
Let's see what she says. Oh, yeah, China has over 3,000 years of written history, right?
Uh-huh.
Well, this is because we see the written record the earliest Chinese characters on these so-called oracle bones, the shoulder blades, the scapula of oxen, and the shells, usually the bottom shells of river turtles. You know, these kinds of large bones of animals that people would eat, and they would use them to they would write some characters on them to ask their ancestors for advice. Could have been anything from let's say, I don't know, will there be a plentiful harvest this year, to will the king's toothache go away, or these
Okay,
kinds of
okay.
questions. And they kept a fairly decent record. You know, they would write down after the event took place that the let's say the ancestors said yes, the harvest would be good, but it wasn't good. There were always binary yes or no questions. So maybe after some time they realized, you know, maybe this is not very accurate, and this kind of divination sort of was not practiced as much anymore.
Right, but we just switched 1,700 years later, because the written record actually point not to Xia, this mythical Xia dynasty, but point to Shang dynasty, which is only began at like 1000 BC, right?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit earlier, sometime around 1600 BC, sometime around this time, the Shang would um, start to be a little more prominent. Let's see what else they said.
Yeah.
Oldest culture they say is Egypt at 8,000.
埃及更古老一些。
Yeah. Yeah, Egypt is older than China, but 但是
呢，文化没有断过流的，始终传承下来，只有中国。
But it's only China, you know, that has been consistent through this with this transmission of culture.
I see. China is special.
So
Okay.
they're maybe not the oldest, but you know,
Mm-hmm.
we are
Makes you like-
consistent.
So Trump was just lectured a little bit.
Let's see if there's more to come.
Okay.
So this is your original form, very much. Yeah, it really is. 这就是原来的文化。
对，
Yeah.
就我们这些人也是原来这个
And people like us,
黑头发、黄皮肤。
Yellow.
Oh,
Yellow skin and black hair.
Xi Jinping just extended the history for 1,400 years in the next sentence,
Yes.
saying that people can be traced 5,000 years back because they had black hair and yellow skin. What
Yeah, well, he can't say, you know, that, you know, people had written records from 5,000 years ago, but at least you can say, you know, they look similar. Even that is, to me, that was always been questionable, because you see these old, you know, old drawings, old pictures of Confucius, you know, with a long beard and so on. So,
Is it trying to say
who knows if they
only
look, how
Chinese
similar
people
they
have
look.
black hair and yellow skin?
Well, those are the people who lived there at that time, apparently. And who
And how do
knows?
they know?
Yeah, that's a good
How
question.
do they know people had yellow skin 5,000 years ago? Do they have some?
So it's a good question. Do they have some mummies
anything?
that they can display? I don't know. Yeah, I mean that's very likely, but you know, you see all kinds of genetic variations in China. It's not quite as clear cut. So most likely, but let's see what else he says.
传承下来，我们叫龙的传人。
We are the descendants of the dragon. Wow.
yellow skin.
So there goes another 5,000 years, I guess. Dragons probably in a
Great.
dynasty.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
I guess.
no, this was just a little funny video, but obviously, you know, most people in China they are aware, right, that the written history does not go back to 5,000 years before the
Well,
present
that's
day.
what everybody claims. If you ask any foreigner how old China is, they say China is 5,000 years old.
Yeah,
Everybody knows
I wonder where this idea of 5,000 years came from. I guess if you include the Shah and round it down a little bit more, or maybe round it up, then you can come up with
Even
5,000 years.
if you include Xia, Xia started like 2,700 years BC. So it's only 4,700 years back. How come they talk about 5,000 years?
Yeah, I mean you can see the Shia. Maybe what they have records of would be around 1900 BC. So maybe they have more records from this era, and these people would live around the lower reaches of the Yellow River, which makes a lot of sense because that's where the land would be most arable, and they would be able to grow a lot of food there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. And they grow probably rice, which was probably one of the reasons why the population grew very fast. The people had crops twice or three times a year.
Yeah, at some points, probably later on, but they could have the, harvest several times a year. So much easier to, you could feed maybe up to three times as many people as, let's say, in Europe or in other parts of the world.
Uh-huh. And another fascinating thing about rice is that it can produce a so-called return crop, which means that would for up to 30 years, which means for 30 years all they had to do was just to cut the top part that grew over water, and they didn't have to plant any seeds, so the rice would grow over and over and over again.
Ah, how
So
easy. So you plant once and you're good to go.
yeah, one generation covered,
Wow, sounds
no
great.
more. All you have to show that there was enough water. They create some terrace, like with water, and job was done. For 30 years, there was just harvest.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that
this
was
is
a good thing.
Yeah, this is the so then Shang was able to sort of control this area much larger than whatever the Xia might have controlled, and this was about 3,000 years ago, around 1,100 BC, and they would you can see these kind of um, different archaeological sites and different cultures that might not have been Chinese. They would the Shang rules would often call them barbarians because they wouldn't be able to, or they wouldn't have invented Chinese writing and so on. But they would eventually, as the state would expand, they would grow to encompass um, these areas and these people who they formerly referred to as barbarians. So if you're talking about real continuity, I mean the continuity is only with this part of China, if you compare it to the present era.
Right, but yeah, I understand. So when we talk about the writing, we are not talking about the writing as we know today. We are talking about some hieroglyphs.
Yeah, I mean,
Like
some of the characters are similar, but some are very different, and not all of them have been deciphered to this day.
right, but it was just the beginning of the writing system they were developing. Like the three waves meant water, and
Yeah, yeah.
eventually changed a little bit in shape, but you can still see the three waves, meaning like the ripples on the surface of water, and so on. So they were literally hieroglyphs, just like in ancient Egypt.
It did the right, and all writings developed essentially in this way. They would start as pictographs, basically pictures that were drawn,
Mhm.
and
Yes, yes, yes.
eventually, you can't draw everything, right? So you might assign, you might draw something the same way, but you might add an extra line to indicate that this is not really the picture, but this is the it's pronounced the same way as the picture. right?
Yeah, got it. So the pronunciation was different. So the language was probably very different than now.
I'm sure it was. I've heard some reconstructions of ancient Chinese, probably after this period, but this is a very long time ago. This is 3,000 years ago. The language must have sounded very different.
Okay, that makes sense. But we are, yeah, when we are talking about our history again, so mentioning Xia. Xia starts probably with Yellow Emperor, who was this mythological person that in the end he reached some immortality, and basically all these myths about something that China has no proofs that existed. It's just like it's just like some stories that were passed from through generations orally, and eventually were put on the paper about 500 BC by some unknown small unimportant historians until Sima Qian, who like in the year like 100 BC eventually sat down, and because his father was also a historian, and finished this wonderful and complex work of Chinese history.
Called the Sheti, which really means the records of the historian, in this case, the grand historian of the Han Dynasty. Yeah, so this was the first time that we tried to see some kind of a backwards historiography to talk about the Chinese culture. You
Yeah,
know,
it was backwards. He wrote about something that he didn't see. Maybe he just read somewhere here and there or heard from some other historians. And this wasn't like a real book of history as we know in
well,
the
obviously he
West.
wouldn't be able to verify these things. Yeah, so he would
Yeah,
say,
and he was
you
making
know,
he was making moral judgments on the characters,
also true.
and
Yes.
he was writing a history to the liking of the Han emperors who were just ruling China over 120 years, and basically he was pleasing them. He was complaining about the very first Huangdi emperor who ruled just before the Hans, and
Yes.
and
You're
then
talking
he
about the Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin state, and
Qin Shi
eventually the
Huang, yes.
Qin dynasty. Now,
Yeah,
if
that's
we, I'm going to get to it, but I want to go back to this map, and I want to point out that there is also the Zhou dynasty mentioned here, which appears at around 800 BCE. Yeah. So the Zhou dynasty, they kind of migrated to the east from the west, and they would eventually defeat the Shang dynasty. The
So would you say they were completely different people?
I don't know to what extent that they were similar, but I assume they were different. Yeah. I have
Yeah.
no idea, or we don't know. We can't really say one way or another how similar they were. I assume they were different. They had a different culture. This is what we know for certain. Because, for example, the main deity of the Shang dynasty was Shangdi, which is still used as the word for God in modern Chinese. But
Right, right.
the main deity of the Zhou dynasty was the heaven or heavens. And the heavens, they wouldn't talk a lot. What they would do instead to show you their support was they would allow you to rule over an area. This would be
Right.
the so-called mandate of heaven. So the Joe claimed that we are not some, evil people who, murdered and took over another,
Right.
maybe a more civilized area. Instead,
Right.
this area was civilized, but they turned bad. They became morally corrupt, and they would essentially say negative things about them. And as a result, the heavens gave us the mandate. And it seems like this kind of an idea would become very popular because it's easier by any successive state to say, well, now you became corrupt, so we get the mandate. So eventually, if you're successful, you get the mandate. If you're not, you didn't. So it's a very, very easy idea to keep track of, to
I think
keep it
it
going.
works also the other way. Not only that you are becoming corrupt, you are about to lose the mandate, and the new ruler should come. It was also the opposite. After they lose the power and were overcome by another tribe, by another kingdom, by another ruler, the people were saying, well, they lost the power, which means they lost the mandate of heaven.
Yes.
It could be
Yeah. So
used
they
also this way.
and they must
Yeah.
have been corrupt. They must have been bad. Otherwise, how could they lose?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly. The heaven is not mistaken.
Obviously, this idea developed over the centuries, but it would, sort of stay in the cultural sphere, let's say.
Right, right. So let me sum up. There is this mythical Xia dynasty that there is no proof that existed. Nothing was ever proven that whatever was found belongs to the Xia, or it's just the any archaeological site. Basically, any archaeological site that was found older than 3,600 years was said, oh, it must be Xia, because we know there was some Xia, but there is no proof that it was Xia or anything else. Okay, so there is this mythological Xia dynasty. Then comes Shang dynasty that probably exists because we have this ancient hieroglyphs written on the ox's shoulder blades, and after that comes probably totally new tribe called later called
Zhou.
Zhou, and they overcome Shang, and they rule until also they become weak and lose power, and all the other rulers.
You can see that
around.
the other rulers around, they would form their own states, right? Right, and
They
they
were
would
probably
declare their
servant.
own kingdoms.
They were servant of the Zhou emperors, but they were gaining more and more power, and eventually the whole empire would fall, and they would just become their own kings in their own, ruling in their own territory that they probably owned.
In the very, very
During-
small part, yeah.
Yes, what they probably owned before that, but they were different people. Like Chu in the south, they were very, very different people than the others.
I would imagine they were, because if you look at it, if according to the traditional Chinese historiography, if the barbarians were all around, but the Chinese state, starts to expand, and it starts to encompass all these barbarians, and they're not.
Right.
So all of a sudden, they're not barbarians. Once we control them, they are not barbarians anymore.
One of us now.
How this was justified in Chinese historiography was that they would start using Chinese rhetoric and so forth, but essentially they became controlled by the state.
Right. So another like a thing that would tip the scale towards believing that it's a continuous civilization, which is not apparently, is that every new ruler would adopt the same writing as the previous dynasty, and they would still believe in this mandate of heaven. That's it. There are two things that they had in common.
Yeah, I don't know if that's it, but that's the only commonalities. Those are the only common denominators that come to my mind right now. Obviously, they would adopt a lot of other cultural practices. Yeah. One more when we get to the Qin dynasty, one more logical development that we can see is that because they all these would declare themselves kingdoms, once the Qin state would be able to defeat its rivals, it would declare itself an empire. It would use a different term, like the Qinshe Huangdi, Huangdi sounding like the Yellow Emperor, right? So they do try to attempt this kind of a backwards continuity, right? At least it sounds similar, right? So they would come up with a new term, and then the successive dynasties would, would kind of go along with this.
So we have this
Yes, it
warring
sounds good.
state after the fall of this ancient Zhou dynasty. We have this 10 or how many warring states fighting between each other for like 60 years, and the result is that mostly unexpected Qin, which resides very west.
Yeah, far to the west. So you would see it would include these kinds of areas which would be sort of inhabited by these so-called barbarians. Yeah. But obviously, if it's on the periphery, it's easier for it to expand. So they one might assume that they might have had some contact with India because quite likely the name for China might come from the Qin state.
That's interesting. Right. So Qin subdued all the other states, and for a short time, like 10 years, united all the states of the center of the center states, and create first.
It's basically its main rivals. Yeah. Then expand a little bit further down to the south. Yeah.
Right, to Vietnam. So they created the first Qin dynasty, which is considered to be the very first dynasty that reunited China, right?
Yeah.
About China, I mean the countries or the kingdoms that were situated in the middle of today's China.
Those that had any power and that sort of, I guess, claimed to be, these kind of worthy successors to the Zhou kingdom that existed before.
Right. However, the first unification of today's China happens, and Qin emperor and later his son rule for like 10 years, and then the first long-lasting dynasty comes, and which is Han, which has nothing to do with today's Han majority, which is like 90% of Chinese people are Hans, right?
Yeah.
So nothing to do, just by name. And Han is established in 220, which can be considered like the second, which is second after Qin, like a second real dynasty that ruled the territory of today's China.
Yes. And at this time we start to see they start taking themselves a little more seriously. They start compiling historical records, and they start expanding a little bit more to the west and so forth. But and this sort of a dynastic pattern then continues with the other successive dynasties. Never mind that at many different times, even after the fall of the Han dynasty in the so during, if we're talking about now, we will be talking about the 3rd century CE. There would be different kingdoms striving for power, but eventually the one that is able to defeat the others, no matter how long it takes, they are included as the dynasty. So it slowly keeps expanding.
Right.
So rather than a continuity, there is an expansion.
Right. So wouldn't you say that China is not the most peaceful country in the world? There's
Yeah,
many
not
Chinese
very
people.
not very peaceful at all. At all. I mean, this is more expanding these kinds of ideas, of us being the victims, and us not doing anything bad. This is something that might have become more prominent after the fall of the last dynasty, the Qing dynasty, at around 1915, when some thinkers started talking about the so-called century of humiliation, when foreign powers would impose their mandates on China, or their
Okay,
will
okay,
on China.
okay, okay. I'm sure we'll get back to it
Yeah. Let's
later.
let's get back, because there are some other things that kind of disrupt this idea of some uh, continuous or homogeneous continuity.